Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our 21st lecture on history of English literature, we are here for you again. Dear friends, we have covered numerous topics under the series History of English Literature. Dear friends, today we would be talking on the Modernist Movement. In the first half, we would be discussing on the making of modernism, whereas in the second session, we would be discussing on the temper of disillusionment. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that for this very discussion on the modernist movement, we have once again with us Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya. Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya is a world-renowned professor who is admired by the students as well as adored and loved throughout in India as well as in abroad. I would like to tell you all that he has authored a book called A New History of English Literature. It is the book where he wrote about women writers of the age. Dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and let's try to grab maximum knowledge on the topic, the modernist movement. Hello sir, welcome to the EDUSET lecture.
Thank you. Well, in this lecture we will be talking about the modernist movement, how the movement came about. It is important to understand because movements generally are launched by a number of people together. It can't be just one man's job. But here, for the first time, we do not have a collaborative effort on the part of a group of people. We have individuals, and those individuals have their own little movements, like imagism, surrealism, vorticism, etc., etc. There was no such movement called modernist movement. All these little movements put together, all these individual efforts put together, we historians gave the name modernist movement. Now, two things arise here. One, why modernist movement has stayed as a phase of history. Because modernism before 20th century was another name for contemporary. Every age was modern when it was in vogue, like Victorianism was, Romanticism was, Augustinism was, Renaissance was, medievalism. All these ages in their own times were called modern or contemporary. But when the next stage comes, that becomes modern or contemporary. It is for the first time in the 20th century that modernism found a location, a definite place in the historical development, which means before this movement or a set of movements, the modern outlook was not there. So, all that went before, all the 20 centuries, 2 millennium, they were not modern. In a way, they were not, because there was a continuity of several things. Religion was one. Then society was another. Nationalism still another. So these concepts, they got a jolt and they were dismembered more or less in the beginning of the 20th century. and the force that dismembered it or disintegrated it or destroyed it was the First World War. As Willa Cather, one of the women writers, she made a remark about World War I. She says that the world fell into two parts after the war, the world before and the world after. So that continuity was broken. And obviously, when you are cut off from your past, from history, from tradition, then lostness follows. Where do you go? You are lost in wilderness. It was this kind of feeling because there was nothing left to fall back upon. So World War I was also a culmination of certain happenings and certain ideas. It didn't come out of nothing. It didn't come out of nowhere all of a sudden. No. For many years, for many decades, there were ideas in the air, ideas that were having their own influence and changing the world. Then there were events that changed the world, particularly in these 50 years of the modernist period, from 1895 to 1945, which means end of World War II. In between, many things have happened. Two world wars have happened which were never before. Wars were local before that. It may be a war in America, war in England or France or Germany or Africa or India. But there was never a world war before in which all the continents were involved. America, Europe, Africa, Asia, all these continents were involved for the first time. War all over. That is why it came to be called the World War. Started in 1914, ended in 1918. So that was one great event of history which changed the world. Then there were men of ideas who were changing in their own ways different sectors of our life, different, sides of our philosophy, our outlook, our ideas. The beginning was made in the 19th century itself by the German philosopher Nietzsche, Nietzsche, Nietzsche. Nietzsche gave a philosophy called death of God. So his philosophy of death of God was that in the times before, ancient times, medieval times, all these 20 centuries, 2000 years, 2 millennium, there was a sort of continuity. It was God's world. Even the Bible said God created Adam and Eve, and then the human race came. So it was a world which was ruled by God somewhere, overlooking, supervising, and punishing, like Adam and Eve. They ate the forbidden fruit and got the punishment for it. But Nietzsche says, in the 20th century now, there is no God. God is dead. And therefore, man is in wilderness. There is no guiding hand. There is no guiding voice, what to do and what not to do. That's why he wrote another book called Beyond Good and Evil. Because in the world governed by God, there were definite, instructions about what is good and what is evil, what to do and what not to do. But once that is gone, you don't know what is good and what is not good. So in that state of mind, and in a world where there is no such power, guiding power to humanity, what would happen? So death of God philosophy and a world without God. Hence, man now becomes individual. The concept of society goes, the concept of community goes, the concept of humanity goes. That is why there was an attack on humanism in the modern age. They thought humanism was responsible for all these silly ideas in the past, making man a weakling, sentimental, driven by his emotions, and not being tough to face life, so on and so forth. On the analogy and pattern of death of God came death of the author. Roland Barthes wrote in 1968 that famous or notorious piece, Death of the Author. And like Nietzsche declared there is no God, it's a godless world. Similarly, it was declared by Roland Barthes, French intellectual, that there is no author. Every text, a poem, a play, a novel, is a structure of words. You have sentences, patterns, then you have paragraphs, you have chapters, then you have books. So he says it is the word which is basic, not the author. And words have their own histories. Languages have their own histories, their own pedigrees. And you have to look into them rather than the intention of the author. There is no author, like there is no God. But the fact of the matter is, you can't wish away either God or the author. The moment somebody puts down a sentence, a set of words, arranges them in a particular order, obviously his or her intention is there behind those words. How come they are otherwise in a particular order and in no other order? Because 101 other orders are also possible. But the fact that he put those words in a particular order, that particular order reveals his intention. Therefore, you can't wish away the author, and you can't wish away intention, because in modernism it was fashionable. In 1934, 2 articles were written called The Intentional Fallacy and The Affective Fallacy. The intentional fallacy about the intention of the author, that it is fallacious. It is wrong to look for intention. But as I explained, it is not really wrong. It is the key. How else the words came into a particular structure and no other. So this modernist structuralism and post-structuralism and so on, the word post here comes for the first time, which has come to stay. As I said, no other era or age in history, it may be political history, it may be literary history or social history, it was never something permanent, because modern had a meaning which was general for every age that is contemporary, age which is present, age which is going on. So that was modern. But here it got fixed, just like the birth of Christ. So everything that came before that birth became BC, before the death of Christ, and after that AD, after the death of Christ. So calendar now begins at a particular point, the birth of Christ, and before and after come pre and post. Similarly in literature now, modernism and postmodernism. So modernism became as important as the birth of Christ, because everything coming after will be labeled as postmodern. Why this? It was never before. And it's a wrong way of giving permanence to a particular phase of history. No phase of history has that, additional importance of the birth of Christ. It's like any other phase of history. There are events, there are ideas in every age, and they have their own effect and influence. And we study them. We see their impact. We see how things change in life because of ideas and events. Very good. But you can't fix history at a particular point. You can't locate modernism in 1895 and thereafter no modernism. It's very strange. Modernism was never before and it will never be thereafter. What comes now after is postmodernism. What went before was pre-modernism. So, what is so important about this modernism? And as I said, there was no movement in the name of modernism. There were little movements, more than a dozen, by individuals. They were doing their own experiments in arts and in their own ways they made a difference. That is granted. Every idea makes a difference. Every event makes a difference. World War I was followed by another event, the Russian Revolution, which is called October Revolution, 1917. Just about the time World War I was ending, there came about the Russian Revolution, a people's upsurge, a people's movement which overthrew the government, and people took over the governance of the state. New experiment, the communists came, new form of government came. People's democracy, they said, in a real sense came, which was not limited to any particular segment, a particular class of people. No high, middle and low, three strata of society divided into classes. So, classless society, 1971, called the October Revolution. So, that was also an important thing. And after that, in 1929, another event of international magnitude took place, although it was confined to the West largely. The event was the Wall Street crash of 1929. Wall Street, by the way, is in America, New York, where you have this business center, where business now of the entire world is decided. So 1929, there came a depression. Economy collapsed, the Western economy. Countries went bankrupt. People faced starvation. And millions had to go into migration from place to place. It was a terrible event that took place in the West, Europe and America. The entire, length of two continents involved. So that is why it is called the decade of depression, 1930s, beginning with 1929 or 1930, right up to 1939, when again another world war begins. So between the two wars, one ending and the other beginning, you had this terrible event of 1929, the depression. And during the depression years, 1930s, obviously literature also had to be affected. there also changes, significant changes came about. And for the first time, you have a sort of socialism or communism, those Marxist ideas finding foothold in Anglo-American literature. Before that, these ideas had no place in the Western world. They were confined to Eastern Europe, Russia, and the surrounding territories. But now writers got attracted to Marxism in the 1930s. Auden Group, for example, in England itself. Then Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck in America. All these writers, they got attracted towards this because the ideas opposed to Marxism, they had failed. Between the wars, depression was a result of the failure of those very ideas. Means liberal humanism, liberal economics. It was a failure of that. Or free market economy, which again is back in our time. So at that time, it got a knock. Because it failed, and therefore people were attracted to the opposite. The opposite was Marxist ideas. Hence, Anglo-American literature also goes Marxist in many ways. All the leading writers, they got attracted, as I said. And you have that impact in their writings. Read poetry, read novel, read drama of the time. Willy Loman, for example, in Death of a Salesman. Arthur Miller in the 50s. He is attracted by those very ideas. And in that great play, is showing an impact of those ideas. Similarly, Hemingway himself joined the war, got wounded in Italy, Italian-Austrian front, fighting there. Fitzgerald, Faulkner, so many of them. Thank you for the time being. Well, in this lecture we will be talking about the disillusionment of the age we call modernism. But strangely, here was modernism where there was total confusion, disillusionment. You have lost all that was in the past, therefore, nothing to fall back upon and nothing to look forward to. On the top of it, the World War, not one, two. So this created an atmosphere of a sort of panic. So people got disillusioned with the Western civilization itself. They started thinking there must have been something wrong that ended this way. That's why the ideas like Decline of the West, a famous book by Spengler. He was a German writer, Spengler. Spengler wrote Decline of the West, and that book became generic. That book became basic, and the subsequent writings, even in poetry like The Waste Land, it is based on the ideas of Spengler's book, Decline of the West. But what does Eliot show in that famous poem, the greatest poem of the age, modern age, 20th century? He shows how the Western civilization has collapsed, and therefore people are in total confusion. Life is in total disarray, and you have nothing to fall back upon. That is why life now becomes the wasteland. It is no longer the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were installed by God and were given the fruits to eat and everything. Now that garden has become the wasteland where nothing grows. It's all rocky. There is no water, no greenery, no fertility. These are the ideas that you find in Eliot's The Wasteland. And he shows different slides, pictures of life from European homes, politics, society, culture, education, everywhere. You find that there is a sense of dislocation. There is a sense of disillusionment. That is why some critics, and which became very popular and permanent name for the 1920s, it was called the lost generation. Actually, it was one of the American writers, Gertrude Stein, who was senior to Hemingway, Hemingway acknowledges that he learned a good deal from her. She was living in Paris. So did Hemingway. And many other writers ran away from America, settled in Paris. Paris was those days the home of the intellectuals, the dissenters, the non-believers, so to say. Just as in earlier times, 19th, 18th century, Italy was the home. You remember the Romantics, Byron, Shelley, Sade, all of them had to flee to Italy and settle there. In the 20th century, Yeats, talking about Ireland, his own country, part of UK, England, Scotland, Ireland. This is no country for old men, young in one another's arms, and so on. So this sense of not belonging anywhere, you don't belong. So this disruption between you as individual, you as human, and your surroundings, your environment, your society, your world, full of science, industry, new ideas, and yet you have lost a sense of belonging. You can't identify yourself with anything surrounding you. So that sense of alienation, for the first time in modernist literature, you have this sense of alienation. You feel alienated from your own environment, from your own surroundings. There is nothing with which you can connect yourself. So all those strings which linked you up with your environment in many ways at different levels, now they are cut off. So you are hanging in the vacuum, in the air, where there is nothing to catch hold of. That's why Proof Rock and the characters in the wasteland, they are homeless people, they are rootless people. So when you become rootless, when you become homeless, when you become an individual, a loner, then life becomes a painful experience, a misery, an anguish. So that is why anguish is key to modernist literature, and the sense of disillusionment being the fundamental reason. It emanates from there. All these subsequent or subsidiary feelings that come, they flow from that basic thing. So a sense of dislocation, sense of disruption, it's a historical disruption. You don't belong to the past and you don't see the future. You are hanging in between. There is neither past nor future. So, this sense of not belonging anywhere, the sense of being an utter individual in the entire cosmos, it is very painful. The anguish that you undergo, it eats you up all the time, living in that consciousness. So, life now moved from the external to the internal. It shrunk into yourself, shrunk into your own mind. The world is not out there, the world is now within. That is why the ideas of Freud, Sigmund Freud, the ideas of Gustav Jung, ideas of William James. Now, these ideas, philosophic, psychological, and beyond morality of good and evil, because that has been rendered irrelevant. But no one knows what is good and what is evil. When you have a godless world, obviously you don't know what is good and what is evil, because there is no source to guide you. Hence, you are again at square one, don't know where to go, all doors closed, all routes closed. You are stoned into walls. There are walls around and walls too stony. It is this kind of feeling of getting suffocated, getting choked. You have nothing except your own self to fall back upon. And that self has been shaken. It has been split. As Prufrock says, split into 1,000 dots, spots on the screen. So, in a way, decomposed. You have been decomposed. World has been decomposed. History has been disrupted. You have been thrown as an individual into wilderness, an alien land where you don't know anyone, any place. It is this kind of feeling. Suddenly becoming an alien, suddenly feeling all alone, suddenly seeing no link with anyone else. So, you have these people analyzing this. With Nietzsche, as I said, it began. Later, these other writers like Freud, he brought those terminologies of conscious, unconscious, subconscious, that memory is not something static and fixed. And in fact, the later scientists, Jung said it is racial memory, it is not your individual. You carry the memories of your entire race to which you belonged earlier. And then there came other writers, even William James. And these later psychologists, scientists, they established that memory is not floating. It is not something where you just have a storehouse of images of your past experiences. They are jumbled together, totally disordered, chaotic. He said, no. Memory is very well structured, and right from childhood it is structured. And therefore, you cannot really say that it is all jungle inside. Mind has its own logic. Maybe not the logic you are trying to impose upon it, but it has an internal logic of its own. That's why William James, with his principles of psychology, came out with new ideas about human mind. And that's why you had new kind of writing coming in literature. Virginia Woolf, for example, the psychological novel, it was an outcome of these very ideas in the modernist period. What do you have in To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway, these two famous novels by Virginia Woolf? You have those leading women characters doing something at home, domestic work, but at the same time their mind not being there. Their minds are traveling back into history, their own childhood, recalling things. And by the time you reach the end of the novel, you find there is a whole history come back through her recall, through her memories, even though she is doing a little thing like washing clothes or cooking a meal. But during that 1 or 2 hours, she was engaged in these little domestic duties. She has surveyed, her mind has surveyed the entire life she has seen in the past 60, 70 years. That is what you see in To the Lighthouse as well as Mrs. Dalloway. Which means you do not have the traditional narrative where time moves in a linear direction. There was time past, there is time present, and there will be time future. This is linear, straight line. But as we are shown, there is no such thing in actual life. Your mind simultaneously can be in the past and can peep into future and can go through the present. So this simultaneity of past, present and future. Now this was the discovery of the modernist thinkers in philosophy and psychology. And William James was one of them, brother of Henry James. the great American novelist who later settled in England, didn't like America much. And Henry James himself gave to the novel the new way of presenting a story, the point of view, technique as it is called. It is credited to him. He gave it. And he gave it because he had read his brother's books, William James's Principles of Psychology, and knew how life is more internal than external. And there is a world of mind itself, parallel to the outside world. And that inner world also never stops. It's live and functioning and moving all the time. Just as on screen you see pictures floating one after the other. Similarly, here in the mind, those pictures, images go on in a stream, and it's a never-ending stream. So you have a new kind of fiction, a new kind of narrative, where time is not linear. It's not moving in just one line, movement of past, present and future. It has its own circles, wavelengths, movements, and it has a world of its own, functioning upon its own principles. It's a matter of analysis. You have to look into its functioning. So that's why not only Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, his famous Ulysses, and even before that, 1917, the portrait of the artist as a young man. So there he follows these ideas. And you have a new kind of narrative which is not traditional. So in a way, things have drastically changed during the period we call modernist. But as I said, the problem with naming of this period as modern, fixing it to a particular phase of history, 1895 to 1945, these 50 years will remain modern for all times to come, and all that follows is postmodern, all that went before is pre-modern. This is very strange. What is that modernism? Earlier was more sensible. Every age is modern when it is in vogue, when it is present. When it becomes past, it is replaced by another age. Now that gets known as modern, contemporary. But to say that only those 50 years were modern and all that follows is postmodern, now how long will postmodern remain? In some writings, postmodern. Now how many posts will you add? Tomorrow 3 posts, Why can't you move away from the modern? Why can't you find a more sensible, label to affix on it? Earlier we had the age of Chaucer, the age of Dryden, Pope, Johnson, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, so on and so forth. But forgetting that, now we say no, only these years were modern. So it is problematic, and this has to be someday sorted out, because as I said, you cannot continue with this post thing forever. And just consider those 50 years as sanctimonious, like the birth of Christ. The history begins there. You can't say that. That history begins with World War I or thereabout. And before that, was there no history? Were there no ideas? So this is problematic that way. We shall have to do away with this and find a more, workable label for these 50 years. Thank you very much. We end on this note.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session on the modernist movement. We believe that all the friends who might have watched us through webcasting would have benefited from this very lecture. Dear friends, if you want to access this lecture the number of times you wanted, then we would like to tell you all that very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you. All the lectures concerning to the series, the history of English literature, are there on YouTube for you, for your accessibility, for your study, and of course we love to have your feedback. So keep suggesting us, keep asking questions through our email ID at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on the vogue of Pound and Eliot. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.